at that. As we count 2 weeks until Christmas Day as we record this. Welcome in. It's Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. And a bit of a treat today for you. Well, it was a treat for us anyway. We hope you enjoy it. About a month ago, we took the show on the road. We were invited to bring the Now and Next podcast to the Public Affairs Association of Canada Conference, and it was held down at George Brown College at the Waterfront campus. Lovely spot. And we got our opportunity to talk about the whys and wherefores of podcasting, and of course, we've talked a lot about it, and certainly our CEO at SSN, Aaron, has written a lot about it lately. And that is that this is the political season of the podcast. It's the emergence of the podcast as a political force of nature. And we saw it certainly in the United States, but we're seeing it increasingly in terms of how the podcast is used for messaging, touching an audience, engaging an audience, maintaining an audience. And so we talked about that and a lot of other sort of broader issues. But we began our discussion with Brad Ross, Bob Reed, Lindsay Broadhead, and Anne-Marie Aikens, our C.A.S.T, Comms and Strategies team here at Now and Next, talking about the state and the well-being of media, and particularly with the group that we were talking to in the room, and that was about the communication strategies and how podcasting fits into it, and how podcasting is now a significant bullet in the arsenal, a weapon in the arsenal, for comms teams to own their media, for brands to own their media. Because, as we know, earned media, if you're in the business, is hard to come by.
How many of you have had struggles or challenges lately, particularly since COVID, with earned media? Has it been more difficult? Yeah, right. And I used to do earned media for lots of folks off the side of my desk, coming out of the newsroom at News Talk 1010 and Global. It was something that I could do. COVID came along, sucked out all the oxygen out of the room. In some cases, entire newsrooms went with it. So there we were. And we have found that in the course of that, the response, the reckoning, the reset has been to be able to say, we need an opportunity for long-form storytelling. But again, I'll emphasize, it's not, gee, we should do a podcast. It has to really be part of the bigger thinking around your comms and your comms strategy. So for us, that works, and I think it really sort of supplements and supports a lot of what you guys had talked about, but again, not to be doing it just for the sake of doing it. If you use it strategically, if you use it as a tool, it'll be really, really effective for you. All of this really is against the backdrop of changing media. And how many of you recall when Jon Stewart started doing The Daily Show? I mean, at some point you guys must have watched The Daily Show, right? And everybody looked at that and said, that's where they're getting their information about the election. What a stupid idea that is. Well, here we are, 25 years later, after The Daily Show and Jon Stewart, and we're at another stage in that. We're at the place where all of a sudden the overnight success has been the podcast, and particularly in the political season. And I'll just set the stage, and then I'll leave it to the team here to kind of comment, because they've all got such a rich background and insights in this. The commentary right now has been around, Joe Rogan. Trump showed up on Joe Rogan. It must mean the podcast is a good thing. Just a reminder, Andrew Yang was on Joe Rogan in 2020. Didn't help him get elected. But the recognition was there that he wanted to go in and touch that audience, right? And I think it's important to say, yes, it had an effect on the campaign in the United States. There's no question about it. It created a great deal of buzz. But it's the aftermath. It's the podcasts that are now telling the story and analyzing what's going on. if you look at and many of them are, sort of Democratic leaning, oddly enough. But of the top 10 news and commentary podcasts in the United States, they're all right-wing podcasts. Right-wing, they're the Carl Tuckersons of the world. Yeah, you know what I mean. And it's funny, he just doesn't rest comfortably in my mouth. But the right has found the way to use that podcast to make inroads. And nobody's talking about the fact that, the right had such a presence in the podcast sphere. They're talking about Joe Rogan because he has 50 million audience members, et cetera. Right now, you're starting to see that universe is really starting to take off. If you want analysis of what's going on, that's where millions of people are going to go, because you're going to get that broad range from right to left. And you can pick and choose where you want to go. It's not just on the cable channels. So we're seeing that change where we saw with the late night shows being the commentary and providing the context for what's next politically. The podcast is where we are now. And I think, this group looked at it and said, Bob, we were talking about the effect of talking to a demographic that wasn't necessarily a political stripe. And that was the advantage of being in a podcast setting. It wasn't about a Democrat or GOP. It was about, what do I need and where do I live and what are my interests and worries?
Yeah, the beauty of it is the ability to narrowcast to an audience that is predisposed to be receptive of your ideas, as well as being able to broaden it out from there. Because as a consumer, and I'm more of a YouTube guy than a podcast guy, I barely watch broadcast network television anymore, because when I have viewing time, I would rather go. I've become a big YouTube fan because whatever niche weird thing I'm interested in on that given day, there is at least a handful of well-done productions that zero right in on that and give me the information and the context I'm looking for. So back to your point about a particular strata or all of them having equalized access, that's the great democratization, I suppose, of the digital media space compared to what's left of traditional broadcast media. And I'll tell you, 2 months ago, I was driving to and from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area. And anytime I'm on a long road trip like that in the US, I find American talk radio just fascinating. So I'm just on the seek button the whole time, trying to find the next station that's going to make me want to almost drive off the road listening to the what they're talking about and how they're talking about it. And there was no shortage of that, but they were all on the hard right side of the spectrum. There was not a progressive, left-leaning, there's NPR out there, but they don't do that much of that kind of talk format programming. And the ones that I did were universally hard right. So having an own media environment, having access to be able to create the content that is agnostic that way, it's not necessarily tied into any lane, is a tremendous advantage. One question that occurred to me, Dave, in your setup is, yes, the tools and the ability to create owned, branded content are there. They're in all of our hands. We can all do this. But how do you get it to that audience? What's the distribution piece? What advice do you guys give to your network clients about, now that you've made this thing, how do you make it fly? Where do you take it to?
We asked that question first, right? So I heard a lot about, we got to understand our audience. Our marching orders are audience first. We put the audience first right at the center of everything we do. So every episode that we produce for whomever it happens to be has to be about the audience in some form or fashion. And if it's not, then they're not going to listen. So as long as we have done that, we'll actually come up with a creed or a mission statement about the show to make sure that we're hitting those buttons, that there's an emotional button at some point that we are hitting with one of the three audiences that we want to reach. And we make sure that they are in the story. We make sure that they are in the show. And when we do that, that's great. So we do our audience development first, then we come back and we'll tell, this is what we heard, create a storyboard that puts those audiences in the middle of that story. And Anne-Marie, when we look at the political side of things, the successful podcasts have been the ones that have done exactly that, whether by accident or design. They are putting that audience first in terms of reaching them and making sure that they identify with the values or the issues that are being discussed.
Absolutely. When I used to lead the communications at a major transit agency that wasn't the TTC. and they were always...
It's called Crosstown.
Crosstown doesn't exist. Come on. They were always in trouble. Not quite as much as they are today, but they were always in trouble. There was controversy after controversy. And in those days, so 5-8 years ago, getting earned media wasn't as difficult as it is today. Today, it's hugely challenging for lots and lots of reasons that you probably have already discussed about the size of newsrooms. But because we were always in trouble, and the media were ripe for stories that were about scandal, mistakes, errors, problems like that. They weren't interested in any good news stories at all that would help the customers that we had. So we did identify that we wanted, how do we reach customers so they hear something beyond all of the bad news that they're reading every day. So we did create a podcast, maybe a little bit before our time. And we had the audiences right there anyways. The customers were right there in our podcast. They were watching all of our channels every day, sometimes many, many times a day. So we did the podcast, and then we would put it where they were getting their transit news. So it was wildly successful. It really had another big advantage, and I think this is an advantage for being so proactive about how you communicate with your audiences, is that it protects you. It builds your good reputation. So when you do have bad times, you have a reputation that's solid out there because they hear from you. They hear about the good things that you're doing. And I think that during my time there, helped us be authentic with our customers, that the media believed what we had to say. We were accessible to them. I believed in transparency. And that it was really successful because of that. We created other own channels as well, like blogs and so forth. Acted like, as I think Dave said, or he said it during our good discussion beforehand, was to create a newsroom internally, and that was really, really successful for us. The other thing I'm pitching now to clients is that not only about creating a podcast, your own channel, because that's really, if you have the capacity to do that, or you go to experts to do it. But there are other podcasts, quite a few of them, where people are getting their news that perhaps speak already to your audiences and that take guests. And so pitching your spokespeople to those podcasts. But it really takes some work identifying the right podcasts to pitch to.
The measure of success is interesting, and again, it's very specific in terms of the whys, and I go back to making certain that it is part of an overarching strategy. Because again, if you just want to put it up there and post it and leave it, it's just not going to work. But Lindsay, when we begin to discuss sort of this evolution of podcasting, Bob's already touched on it. It happens because you are engaged on your own terms. And I think whether it's for the brand or whether it's for a political show or a news show, that can't be understated in terms of the value.
No, and first of all, hi everyone, this is a lot of fun. It is on your own terms, and there's some pros and cons to that, and I think that's what we're seeing transpire in the sector right now. When when I was in agency land, actually the bulk of, there's some agency people here I know, it was impossible, even before 2019, it was impossible to get some clients coverage. How many times did you have the CEO rock into the office and say, I will give you the money, but I want the cover of the Globe and Mail, right? Or I want the cover of this. And you're kind of like, your boss is in the room or whatever, and you're like, we'll do our best, we can't guarantee news, you'd have all your lines. So it's out of your control, even if you're highly motivated in a circumstance like that. What you can have in your control is your own story, right? And the panel keeps touching on that, is what is the story you want to tell? Who wants to hear it? And we need to change the way we measure success, the way we measure impact. It's the measurement that's been kicking us in the butt since the beginning, because we're not getting, and nor should we aim for, and you guys know this, the million hits or the circulation. That doesn't matter anymore. It's about hitting the critical few. And with podcasts or anything long form, it's so counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you understand that long form is the most shareable of content. Because if I'm listening to the We Can Do Hard Things podcast, which I'm not ashamed to admit that I listen to, along with all the good political podcasts out there, but you need different shareable content, and it will form this incredible community around it. So if you're working for an engineering company, if you're working for a mining company, if you're working for a hospital, that stuff is so unsexy to so many readers, but it is the runway model hit for that company, as it should be. And there is a whole stratosphere and environment of others who also think it is fantastic. So getting that group, that cohort to listen, and on your collective terms, that's when you're going to really make an impact. And then the gravy on top, of course, is I think what the creative currency team was speaking about before, is you can cut it, you can fashion it to however you need on your socials, to your customers, to whoever your stakeholder audience is, and re-share it, re-amplify it. So long-form content, people going deep into your brand, also can become the quick hits.
Yeah, the notion that we have this short-term, attention span flies in the face of the success of a Rogan show at just like 3+ hours. People will spend the time with it if it's about them. If you make the show about them, they watch, they listen, they engage. So it is driven by content, but it's critical to be able to say my audience is at the center of this discussion, of the conversation, because otherwise, well, it's just content that's out there that looks and feels good. But Brad, the intention of that has to be fairly well articulated. I mean, we come back to it, and we already used the phrase, it was wildly successful. Make sure you define that before you have pushed record or started to create any content.
I mean, I think with every strategy you mentioned the state, you got to identify who your audience is, and you got to go to them. Where are they? If it's a bunch of gamers in their basement on playing video games, you got to go to them with content. This is where, the right, if you will, the political right in the United States was so successful in this last election campaign, is that's where they went, and that's where these, the manosphere, that's where they are, if that's your audience. The other audience, I think it's important to remember, is are your employees, right? Wherever you work, if you work in a large organization especially, they are a key audience. So in developing the strategy around owned media, say for this hospital, it's in a community. A community is really interested in what is happening in their hospital, but you got to make it engaging. And so you got to bring your employees into it as well and make it engaging for them, because they become critical ambassadors and frankly, comms officers for you by default.
Yeah, well, one of the most successful podcasts is produced by Trader Joe's. They started doing a podcast, as Brad described, to be internal, just this internal communications, and their customers started to listen to the show, and they were so fascinated by what went on behind the curtain that the show just took off. And it was not by design, it was strictly by accident. But what they did was they put their audience, their customers, their consumers in that story. And they didn't realize it until, holy cow, look at that, this thing's on fire. So and if you listen to the show and you listen to them talk about how it evolved, it's a fascinating case study in, that's how we talk to people. And this isn't just happening here in Canada and the United States, North America. When we looked at the sort of election landscape and the political landscape, Lindsay, in Europe this past year, we saw major shifts from right to left or right to left. The podcast medium became central in that conversation, not just in, vote for this guy, don't vote for that guy. It was a news commentary that really resonated with those audiences in Europe.
Yes, and I mean, this room is as well-versed, more well-versed, probably than me on all the intricacies of what did or didn't happen in our, the recent U.S. election, in European elections, and what's happening, frankly, across the globe. Any reduction to one or two simple causes, my instinct is that that's incorrect, right? There's this multifaceted rationale for why we are going in the way that we're going. And why I bring that up is only because I'm struck by, you said the manosphere. Is that the correct technical term?
It is.
Thank you.
I'm not a member,
Thank
although
you.
I am a man.
I'll refrain from.
You
Carry
on.
Verify.
No fact check there.
Yeah, no. Oh, God. I will never be served up for my own political reasons, and the fact that I am not a man. I will not be served up the podcast segments that moved America, that moved, the right in France, that has mobilized the right in England. And it's not because I'm not interested in learning. In fact, I'm doing this very perverse, aggressive search on various right-wing podcasts right now for this very reason, is I'm trying to understand more, right? But I'm only being served up a sector. And most everyone in this room is also only being served up particular information. So this notion of a divide is both true and a farce. And I'm going to pose questions and not give answers because I haven't come to my own conclusions yet. But it's an illusion as much as it is, and a performance of division as it is a reality. And it's because we only have access to so much information. There isn't the, family gathering around the 1950s TV. There isn't the family gathering around to watch, Family Ties, Cosby Show, whatever it was that everyone was watching at that time. No, there's the family with, as many people as there are devices now, each being served up different information. My kids are listening to some dude called Mr. Beast, who I understand is the biggest content creator in the world. When you have Ronaldo challenging a guy named Mr. Beast to become a content creator, I realize how out of touch I am, right? But nor should I be necessarily. My father's listening to something else. My mom, so it's this division. So again, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's this fascinating trajectory to follow, which is we're creating this content, but we're also creating islands of information. And we need to choose, how we bracket that information, what audience is valuable to us, but also I think ethically, what are the consequences of not sharing it, not bringing it out, because what we're seeing in Europe, what we're seeing in the States is very purposeful walls, and I guess that's an interesting word right now, but very purposeful walls being built around content so that it's safe to have 3-hour rambling conversation about manosphere issues, right? And it's fascinating and scary to me at the same time.
But let me suggest that, and there's this overarching tone about the manosphere and Joe Rogan, and he was talking to a bunch of guys who were sitting in the basement playing video games and vaping. It's exactly who he was talking about. And we diminish them in as much as we think that, we dismiss them. And what the electorate...
Just be clear, I'm not dismissing them at all. I think
Well-
they're a critical audience that they've tapped into. They've gone where they are.
But what we have done, though, is ignored why they sit in the basement and vape, only play video games, right? So what motivates them is not necessarily the right or the left or anything that Trump may have said or not said. It's not about immigration for them. It's about making sure that they got a job and can afford to whatever, groceries, etc. And we've heard all that. There's a guy named Scott Galway, and he's on a podcast called Pivot. And he does some really interesting research into this. And he talks about, with no he's clearly a Democrat-leaning commentator. But he'll look at it and tell the Democrats, for example, you guys missed the boat entirely, because when you said what you stood for, and they listed all of the things that they stood for on their campaign website, and what was not there, and this is going to sound silly maybe, but men were not on that list. And so when they talked about young white men, and we're in favor of 75% of the rest of the population, are you actually in favor of 75%, or are you discriminating against the 25%? And that's the tone and the attitude that they were able to tap into. That was the value that audience heard when Rogan opened his mouth when he talked to Trump. So it sounds perverse, but it's a really great example of how they captured the attention and the engagement and motivated an audience that wasn't otherwise motivated. They became champions for the Republicans and champions for Trump. And Bob, at the end of the day, by doing that, who would have thought, we were saying 4 years ago, that Donald Trump was not only going to broaden his base, he was going to win the popular vote in the United States.
Yeah, those two ideas together are pretty incredible. How much did he broaden his base on Joe Rogan would be the question, because...
I think he touched on the base that he broadened, but
yeah.
I get your point.
Yeah, I mean, that was already an in the tank audience. So, and by the way, for those of you following along, Joe Rogan is the winning item on the drinking game for this panel. I think we're about 6 into it. And it brings a question up to me. Like, yeah, that was a 3-hour-long interview. I didn't watch the 3 hours of it. I watched the clips that flew around from it, as I'm sure probably most people did. And what I'm trying to get my head around is something we talked about internally before coming here today, is the sort of split between the podcast world. So much of it is very long form. I mean, 3 hours is pretty extreme, but most of it seems to be an hour plus. That's still a long time commitment for people. And yet, all I also keep hearing is that we live in this short attention span universe. That and you look at the changes in some of the platforms. You look at the popularity of TikTok, that's 60 or less. You look at YouTube moving to YouTube Shorts, which I think has the same time limit on it. It's these little bite-sized things. And Lindsay, you said you find the long form stuff the most shareable. I find the short little blips are the ones that fly around the most.
I was surprised to read. I mean, maybe I'm reading an unverified legacy media source when I quote this, but yeah, I heard that. Sorry, you don't have to hold this for me. I'll do it for you in return.
Well reported.
Yeah, that's right.
Dying hard.
No, I just read that because of the nature of the community that the content is building, and that it's set if done right? So if Dave's company does it for you, it will target particular audience sectors that want to share it because that's what they do and that's what they're passionate about.
That's the champion nature of that audience, right? Yeah. when we get into it, just to that point, one of the things that we do, specifically when we start to talk about branded and owned media, we approach it, and Anne-Marie already used the phrase the newsroom, we approach it from a journalistic perspective. We go in there as the newsroom. We're not there as spinning a message. We want to make sure that what we're doing has integrity in terms of the storytelling that it does. So we, and to some degree that drives the clients we work with. Many of them are mission driven, that sort of thing. So that's our lane, but that doesn't mean that's the only place for the podcast, but it gets at that authenticity, it gets at that level of transparency that you kind of need to have if the podcast is going to resonate. Just some stats, and not to burden you with numbers, but this week I saw a piece that was published out of the UK, and they did this really incredible in-depth analysis of broadcasting in the UK. I was blown away, and I've been in radio a long time. I was blown away by the number of radio companies in the United Kingdom. Extraordinary, like dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. We're sitting right next door to Chorus, which is one of the, 3 or 4 big companies in Canada. Admittedly, we don't have the same population, et cetera, but that's beside the point. It's thriving, their radio industry in the UK. But, and here's the stat that jumped out at me, 25.7% of listening hours to UK radio are now on AM and FM. Only 25% of radio listening is on AM and FM. The rest of the listening is done on digital audio broadcasting. So you're firing up their app and they're listening. 22% of all of the audio listening is done through podcasting. So you're starting to see AM, FM decline and podcasts take over. And the ability to access it on your device is playing a critical role in all of that. When we look at where people are listening, even where they're watching, whether it's the YouTube shorts or the video, your phone becomes that device that is the primary. And I know many of you will know that based on the campaigns you've done. So the shifting landscape speaks to me, Anne-Marie, where this is where I think the big networks and media, for example, just journalism generally, missed the boat on this recent election in the United States. They not only didn't see it coming, they weren't willing to admit that the shift is there, that the reckoning isn't just going to have to be about what is the Democratic Party all about? What are the cable news networks? And I put Fox in there as well, I mean, being on the winning side. What are they all about now? Because that conventional legacy approach to media is going to be in the rearview mirror so fast, based on the way you've seen these numbers shift. I don't think they are prepared to admit that there's an issue, and that's, one way or the other, that's going to be a problem for them in the next 5-10 years.
Well, I think they have. I think they are having those conversations over and over and over again. But in the meantime, they are reducing their newsrooms significantly, and that's becoming a problem. That's why we can't get earned media for anything. But I think some of them are starting. I notice, like all of the radio stations, all the talk radios, they issue their the snippets, parts of their 3-hour broadcasts that they have. They issue them on podcasts, and so you can access this 20-minute. When we do talk radio frequently, they issue them in podcasts so people can digest them away from the radio station into a podcast format.
But let me draw the curtain back. Having sat in the newsroom at those talk radio stations, nobody listens to that. No, they don't. Primarily, the radio listener behavior is different than the podcast listener behavior. And that's where I think there's a disconnect between the legacy media, understanding that this is new media. It's not just clip this and throw it in on a podcast feed. So there's a bit of blinders going on.
There is. I agree with that too, because I think they've seen the stats that most, I think that's why we're talking about this today, is because the more people got their news about the election in the U.S. from podcasts that they trusted from podcasts than they did from legacy media, or any of that. So there is a fundamental distrust for media that whether or not it's right or wrong, but if the the landscape has changed, and it is going to have to fundamentally change the way they do work. And I don't know what it's going to look like even 5 years from now. No idea what it's going to look like. And I think there's probably lots of protection going on now because there's lots and lots of jobs and lots of funding that they get as a result of it. It is going to change, and I'm not quite sure they're ready for it. I think the Democrats didn't embrace that either.
No, they didn't. No.
They stuck to the legacy media and didn't even, they didn't hold news conferences, and that is viewed as a pretty big mistake. But they also didn't reach their audiences. They thought the women were going to win the vote for them, and fewer women voted for Kamala than did Biden the election before. So they didn't win them, and I think it's because they underestimated economic interests and how important that is to people and how much people are hurting. That's probably because most of the people in the Democratic campaign are all privileged people, so they thought for women that the most important thing would be reproductive rights. Well, if you can't feed your family in the first place, if you don't have a job, and your economic interest has to be your priority. And if I think they saw the alternative was for the Republicans, that maybe I'll have more money at the end of the month than I do now. So.
Well, and the other side of that is, and again, I'll go back to the putting your audience at the center of it, Bob, and you brought up the question of, moving forward, what's the efficacy of actually producing a Sunday news morning show anymore where, Meet the Press and all of that Meet the Press, that's way back in the 50s, 60s. They haven't even changed the name of it. Nobody got excited about the what 60 Minutes had to say as much this time around. They are losing touch, and they're losing their influence, and they cost a shit ton of money to produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they used to set the agenda.
Exactly.
The Sunday morning shows used to ripple on into the beginning of the week with follow-up coverage and analysis based on who said what on those panel discussions. Those days are gone. Also, the idea of mainstream or major market newspaper endorsements.
Yep.
Remember the firestorm in the campaign just passed, where the LA Times,
Washington Post.
Washington Post, sorry, and what was the other one?
Times as well. It was the LA Times.
Times, yeah. Who refused to endorse candidates, and there was some corner office pressure at play on that. But at the end of the day, it didn't matter. There was more attention paid to that side of the story than the value, the benefit for either campaign of an endorsement. So those days are gone as well. And something you said, Dave, brought another question to mind for me, and that is, okay, so given the shift that's underway to the rise of owned digital media, podcasts principally, how do you crack into that? One way is create your own, of course, as we've talked about. But we all used to pitch existing media programs and outlets on stories on, hey, you should have my client on as a guest. Is that at play in the podcast world? Is there a way to do that?
Entirely. There are actually agencies out there right now who will suggest to you, I need a guest who has an expert on, and they list them, and they'll actually do the cultivation and the curation for you, mm-hmm. on the one hand. The other part of it is that there's an opportunity, and I think maybe Anne-Marie had mentioned this, the idea that the podcast host, and we try to do that with some of our folks, is to put them in other podcasts, because it's the advantage to that is you are already putting them in an environment where podcast listening is a priority, right? So to have them show up on the radio is great. To have them show up, with an op-ed in the Globe and Mail is okay. But if you've already got somebody who is listening to podcast A and you put your podcast host in that show, they're more likely to refer it back to that podcast. It's an interesting behavioral view in terms of the ROI and the impact. So I think, yes, there are places to do that, and for sure there's a segment out there, and I suspect that some people in this room do this already. The only thing that's important here, and Lindsay mentioned this, it's not strictly about any more impressions. It's not about circulation. It's not just about the cume on the radio station or on TV. The real value in any of this is the amount of time that audience has spent with your content, the amount of time that they have spent with your product. And we did a show for a client here in Toronto. It was a year ago. And at the end of the day, it was a nonprofit. They had to go to their board and say, this was the outcome, this was the effect, this is why it was worthwhile doing. And they had a budget, number of thousands of dollars, whatever it was, and we did X number of episodes. And by doing an analysis of the amount of time, the engagement on the podcast, we were able to put a dollar value on the number of minutes that people spent with that content, that product. So we had engagement levels on some of these podcasts of 80, 90%, meaning that if it was a 30-minute show, they were listening to 24, 27 minutes of the whole show. Now, I dare you to go to any other medium and tell me that you're going to have that kind of engagement, content, contact for that period of time, that deeply in any other setting. So for $1, in this case, Andre, I think it was like 7 minutes of attention, right? You're not going to get that elsewhere. And again, this is not to say that's the only way to do it, but if you're talking about how do you get at that audience and where's the value in connecting with that audience, it's the amount of time that they have spent with you because you made the story, you made the content about them. And in this case, it really was. The audience was front and center in this series. And they had exceptional, and it wasn't a big flashy show or anything. They didn't have crazy atmospheric downloads, but they had an audience that spent a great deal of time. And then, when it came time for fundraising, then it came time to sign up for the newsletter, then it came time to do, the door-to-door campaign, whatever it was they were doing, because it was the month for their cause. They had all kinds of support that they wouldn't have otherwise had by using the other media. So, we've kind of stretched this out in terms of the flashy Joe Rogan experience, the big numbers, the 50 million opportunities to touch an audience member in his case. But what has come out of all of this in our experience is that we have found that once you're in, and again, you make it about that audience member, they stay. And the value of that champion, the value of that ability to go long form and to talk about the issues that are not going to get picked up on or talked about in traditional media is a huge value for you. But again, you can't just do it on its own. It has to be part of a really robust, thoughtful, well-planned strategy that deals with your marketing and your comms, because we've had clients who said, we're going to do it, and then they just let it kind of sit on the vine and they didn't do anything with it. And guess what? Nobody spent a whole lot of time with their content, despite our best efforts to have them do so. So just quickly around, if you've got a final thought, Bob, in terms of where you think all this is going to land in the next week or the next 2 years, or how this is going to play out.
I'm still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
I think like so many of us, we're living through an evolution here. We're seeing how things are tracking. We're seeing how things are shifting. I think this most recent presidential campaign had a lot of lessons in it coming out of it that are going to be observed by so many others in politics and public affairs. So I think one of the key things is to be nimble and to be mobile in your thinking, because that evolution is going to continue. The landscape is going to continue to shift. I don't think there's any clarity as to where it's ultimately going to end up. And so the challenge is going to be to keep up with it and to keep moving as it shifts further.
Yeah, as our friend Jim Richards would say, go brave.
Exactly.
Lindsay, what do you think?
So a few things. First of all, I think the ship has sailed. So I think we're being almost too generous to legacy media right now. They play a very important role, but the ship has sailed. Premier Ford had his own station in his first election, so that was a while back.
Well, I'll remind you that Stephen Harper had his own YouTube channel before anybody, so he
I
was
would
way ahead
not
of the
have
game,
watched
right?
that necessarily. However, that's good to know. One thing I'm really interested in is my passion really is around corporate communications, and all the data up to COVID pointed to brands and CEOs in particular having empathy, having a personality, leaning into political issues. I think that is also like a huge question mark over that particular trend right now with October 7th and with this recent leaning to the right of politics and media. Corporate communications is going to forever change again. So that's going to be an incredible thing to watch. And the only last thing I'll add is underpinning all of this when we talk about audience, messaging. It's a lost art for communicators. And I think we need to demand of ourselves, but also our teams, to have incredible diligence and almost a militaristic approach in nailing the key message targeted to audience and supporting it with incredible proof points. And that is the nerdiest thing I'll have said all day, but I'll double down on it.
Audience first. Brad?
Well, nice segue on the message. Let me go back. Somebody once said the medium is the message. And I think we're really seeing that today. I mean, I think we can go back to basics and talk about the long game in our communications efforts and remembering our audiences and remembering what we say. But I think the days of your candidate standing at a podium, fielding questions from reporters for 45 minutes is over for the most part. You get the odd scrums here and there, but I think the medium, in this case, we're talking about podcasting as a key medium in various forms is critical. Digital. I sit on my couch at night, and my wife's across the room, and I send her TikToks
text her messages
and Instagram reels, right? And wait for a laugh and continue to do my little search. But then when I'm preparing dinner or I'm driving, I'm listening to long form pods. We're all on our phones all the bloody time, right? So let's not forget that. And how can we best leverage that medium to tell our stories? Because we're looking for stories. We want to be entertained and we want to be informed at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Anne-Marie?
I think that just the last comments I would, and perhaps advice I'd have for you, whether you work for a brand or you work in an agency, is to make sure, because if audience is everything, then your team that you work with should reflect those audiences. So they should be diverse. They should be, you have all of your different audiences to try and reflect that in the team that you work with. So you can be able to help you think like those audiences. That's really important, and I think it's sometimes what we forget that. The other thing that one of my fears about what's happening with the legacy media and what's going to happen in the next 5 years is one of the biggest, the thing I look for the most in legacy media is that they help keep our governments accountable through the long-form investigations and the investment that they put in long-form investigations. So I really hope that survives somehow, whether it's in podcasts that are devoted to that kind of attention or how that's going to be replicated. Otherwise, there's no one holding our governments accountable, and that's really important to me.
Amen. Bob Reed, Lindsay Broadhead, Anne-Marie Aikens, Brad Ross, Thank you. Thanks to the folks here at the Public Affairs Association of Canada and Elliot for reaching out and inviting us to be part of the show today. If you're so inclined, feel free to drop us a comment if you're listening to the show. I've also got a talkback message, so if you actually want to be part of the show, dial in and leave us a message there. So I'm Dave Trafford. Thank you. This has been Now and Next Live, our very first. This was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun. So we're hoping to do that again. And if you've got a group that would be interested in having us, bring the podcast to your event, by all means, reach out to me. You can find me on all the socials. I'm on, LinkedIn is probably where you find me most, but you'll also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and on Blue Sky. Right, I'm there as well. And I got kicked off Twitter a while ago. You can find me at Dave Trafford's Podcasts on X. So if you look that up, you'll find me there. Otherwise, just leave us a comment or leave us a note, and you can go to davetrafford.com and get all the details about all of the shows that we do. That includes On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, Now and Next, and find out more about what we have going on at Story Studio Network. And if you want to leave a message, there's talkback buttons there for all the shows that I'm doing. And we'd love to hear from you. So enjoy your week, and as we press on to Christmas, and don't forget, this week we'll also have On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Kathleen Wynne, former Premier of Ontario. Tim Hudak is the former PC leader here in Ontario. And John Wright, Keith Leslie, and I are all around the table, and we'll kick around the details and the debate points of what's gone on in Ontario politics, particularly at Queen's Park. And maybe this is going to be a running thing. Doug Ford becoming a regular guest on Fox News as we head into Trump 2.0. All right, that'll do it for us here on Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.